Well, good evening, everybody. It's great to virtually be with you, and I'm so excited for this conversation we're having. This is an economic opportunity town hall, and I couldn't be more pleased to be joined by one of my mentors and friends and fraternity brothers, Congressman Bobby Scott from Virginia's 3rd Congressional District. We're going to have just a great conversation over the next hour about some of the most pressing issues. Congressman Scott is well known. He's one of the leaders, absolutely, of the Virginia delegation here in Congress, has been in that seat in Virginia's 3rd District since 1993 and currently serves as the chairman of the Committee on Education and Labor in the U.S. House of Representatives. But when I tell you this guy knows his policy, he's just smart as a whip. And I know we've had the chance to sit down and talk through some policy, get deep into the weeds. And so I'm so excited for the conversation tonight. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to my good friend and mentor, Congressman Bobby Scott.
Well, thank you very much, Cameron. Certainly a pleasure to be with you, and I'm looking forward to serving with you in the United States Congress. We need a doctor in there. Healthcare is a major issue, and so we're looking forward to you coming in. You have a legal background too, and so you won't be confused by a lot of the technical legislative language and that kind of thing. But your background in healthcare will be very much appreciated. We're talking about the economy and economic opportunity, and there are a lot of things that we can do to help people get better jobs. The first, we need to increase the minimum wage to that bill has passed the House. It's waiting for Senate action. I think you'll be in Congress before the Senate acts. But the minimum wage right now at $7.25. There's one study I saw that showed that there's no county in the United States in which a full-time 40-hour-a-week minimum wage worker can afford a modest 2-bedroom apartment. Now, I didn't say San Francisco or Manhattan. No county in the United States where a full-time minimum wage worker can afford a modest 2-bedroom apartment. You know that's not right. And so we need to increase the minimum wage. We also know that those with the best education get the best jobs. So we need to improve K through 12, but particularly opportunities in higher education. We need to make sure that people can be able to afford to go to a 4-year college to get a liberal arts degree, but there are a lot of other opportunities. Most people won't be getting a 4-year liberal arts degree. And so we have to make sure that all of the other options are available. Community colleges now have done a much better job at specific job training. We in the Higher Education Act reauthorization, we're doing something called a short-term Pell, where right now you can use a Pell Grant only on courses that lead to a degree. If all it leads to is a good job, can't use a Pell Grant. Well, that's ridiculous. Ought to be able to use a Pell Grant, but we need to make sure that we control the quality. And so we want to limit that opportunity in such a way that we make sure that people who use the Pell Grant for these short-term programs are getting a quality credential. Last week, the committee reported an apprenticeship bill to make sure to create 1 million new apprenticeship opportunities. And we're not limiting them just to the traditional building trades, healthcare and other industries where apprenticeship programs can be designed are anticipated. And there'll be, like I said, 1 million opportunities. We need to end discrimination if we're gonna help people move up. You've done everything right and you don't want you to be sabotaged by invidious discrimination. We passed legislation on that. The PRO Act makes it easier to join a union. Joining a union ought to be a right, not a fight. Those that join a union get better benefits, better pay, and interestingly, equal pay for equal work. In a union contract, people are not discriminated against. If you're doing the equal job, you get the equal pay. And we want to care about workers generally. We've seen in this COVID-19 pandemic that workers are exposed to the coronavirus, and there are things we can do to minimize the risk. The first thing we ought to do is have OSHA, Occupational Safety and Health Administration, OSHA, to do its job There are no enforceable regulations, and they have the authority to have emergency temporary standards to create standards so that people can, so that they can do their jobs. There are no enforceable standards now, notwithstanding what's happened in the healthcare, the nursing homes, the meatpacking plants, the prisons, no enforceable standards. Virginia passed enforceable standards. So in Virginia, the workers are protected, and that's just within the past few weeks. They've established enforceable standards. So we need to do that to show that we can reduce the chances that you're going to get infected. We need to have testing so that if there's a virus, if the virus is spreading through the workplace, you find out before it's too late. We need to make sure that if you're infected on the job, if you're a federal employee, that's all we have jurisdiction over, you get workers' compensation. So your health care and your wages are covered. Or if you're not a federal employee, your treatment is covered. And you get health care. Make sure that health care is available. Regrettably in America, if you lose your job, you lose your health care. So that you want to be able to extend your health care under a subsidy program. All of that's in, we've already passed legislation in the House to do all that, paid leave and heroes pay. All of that is what we're doing as Democrats in the House. And tell me what the Republicans are doing for workers in similar situations. Wrong, not nothing, less than nothing. They're watering down OSHA, and they're giving immunity to employers who might have to pay if they're negligent and cause someone to be infected. If you can prove you got it on the job, nobody's ever been able to do it yet. But in that offhand case, you ought to be able to. You have a right. They're going to take that right away. Now we have shown our support for so far in the CARES Act. CARES Act has maintained the economy. We need additional action going forward. We need to make sure that those who lose their jobs going forward, and record numbers of people are losing their jobs. Today's Thursday, this morning, 800 and some thousand people filed for unemployment benefits. Before the pandemic, the national record in the unemployment compensation program was 600 and some thousand. 800 and some thousand, at least 800 and some thousand have filed for the last 20 some weeks. Right. It's off the chart. And so we need to make sure that their unemployment compensation is retained, where they get a little extra so they're not strained. We have a housing epidemic. The people are going to get evicted right and left if we don't do something. Childcare industry is about to collapse. Education, we need to help state and local government so that they don't have to lay off everybody and the services that are provided aren't there. The Republicans, all they've done is set the pause button. They've done nothing until a few days ago. They finally came up with a proposal and then promptly defeated it in the Senate. And so they're still doing nothing. That's why we're not even bothering to discuss anything with the Senate. We're going directly to Secretary Mnuchin and trying to negotiate. The airlines are going to start laying people off, tens of thousands per company, if we don't take some action. And the Senate does not have time to take up a bill. They do have time to consider the confirmation of a Supreme Court justice, after they said 4 years ago that they would, that as a matter of sanctimonious principle, you don't fill vacancies 10 months before the end of a presidential term. Now, a few weeks before the term, they're going to come back and rush through a Supreme Court nominee. And why do they need to rush? Because there is a case coming the week after the election that can take away your health care, and they need her in position so that she can vote and take away your health care. That is outrageous, and that's why we need somebody like Cameron Webb there who appreciates health care. And if they do mess it up, you'll be there so we can fix it. If we have the House, the Senate, and the White House, we can fix it, whatever the Supreme Court does. And if we don't, they'll mess it up, and those with pre-existing conditions will just be at risk. People have said they don't have a plan. That's technically not true. They do have a plan. They had a plan that passed the House. and the CBO scores, Congressional Budget Office scored it. It said if that bill passed, and it did pass the House, John McCain killed it in the Senate.
Yeah.
It said if it became law, costs would go up the first year 20%. 20-some million people would lose their insurance.
Right.
Pre-existing conditions, you'd start losing you'd lose your protections, and the insurance you get, because they don't require essential benefits, will be worse than what you got. That's what's going to happen when they mess up the Affordable Care Act, and that's why we need you in the Congress. So as soon as they do it, we can fix it. And so, Cameron, I'm looking forward to serving with you. With your background, you're exactly what we need, and so we're just looking forward to working with you, and can't wait till you get elected.
Well, I want to jump into the questions because I love to spend this time. And what's funny, Congressman Scott, if I can, I want to just give folks a little bit of background on our relationship, because I met you when I was 20 years old in my first year in our fraternity, and I got to introduce you at an event. And I remember when I came around again last year, 2019, and said, Congressman Scott, I'm thinking about running for Congress. You were like, oh, okay, come talk to me. Let's just find a time to talk. And what you did is you said, okay, we had a conversation about healthcare. And I talked about my expertise on healthcare. We talked through a lot of these issues, things that you just described. We talked about that American Health Care Act. We talked about the 23 million people who lose insurance. We talked about the fact that that's not the path forward. But you said you need to know more than healthcare. The economy is so important. And so much of your legislation, your work with education and labor has been focused on our economy. And I think it's really interesting. You've got to have a depth of understanding in so many spaces. You touched on a bunch of them just then. You touched on that idea that I talk about a lot in my campaign, which is economic mobility. It's that idea that everyone should have opportunities for growth. Now, before we jump into the questions, I just want to pivot back to something that you said, because you were talking about Republicans and the plan, and I want to revisit the moment when we passed the CARES Act, because we actually did pass something that Republicans supported, that the president signed, that served the American people. Why can't we have more moments like that? It was absolutely a crisis. That's where I want to be, right? I want to be in that space where we're able to work with other people, find common ground, and move things forward. Tell me what's the difference between that original CARES funding and all these other circumstances, even the moment that we're in right now. How can we find more moments like that?
Chairman Powell at the Fed said that that the CARES Act and the subsequent legislation and the previous legislation propped up the economy, so that it was really a surprise, because right after when the pandemic started, the Dow Jones Industrial Average dropped from about 27,000 down to 18,000. Mm-hmm. But because we passed the CARES Act and the economy was supported, it went right on back up to where it came from.
Right.
He has said that that's about to run out. He has said that the risk of doing too little is a lot more than the risk of doing too much.
Well, he said this isn't a moment for austerity, essentially, and I think that's right. This isn't the time when you tighten your belt necessarily, because there's so much we need to do. And so when you talk about fiscal policy and monetary policy, the Fed has done all they can do, right? They've really done everything they can do on their end of the policy. So in the monetary policy side of things, that's taken care of. But on the fiscal side, what can we do?
Well, we can pass that the next bill, keep and do the same thing for the economy that the CARES Act did. You have an airlines industry that will collapse without support. You have state and local governments, they'll be laying people off, adding to the unemployment. You have education. You're not going to open the economy without opening the schools. There are expenses in opening the schools safely. Three big parts of it would be smaller class sizes, because if you're spreading children around, you won't be able to get as many in the classroom, so you're going to have smaller class size. You need more teachers. Getting them to the school. If you can't pack 40-some students in a bus, if you only have half as many in a bus, then you got to have twice as many trips. That's more expensive. And ventilation is a problem. They say, you know how you can eat in a restaurant outside but not inside? That's because if you're inside, people are breathing the virus. If there's not proper ventilation, so everybody's going to be breathing the virus. Everybody's affected. If you have proper ventilation, you don't have much of a problem. GAO did a study that came out early in the summer that showed that 40% of the school districts in this country need to repair, replace their HVAC, heating, ventilation, and air conditioning, the HVAC systems. 40% of the school districts need to repair, replace HVAC systems in more than half their schools. Well, if they couldn't fix them before the pandemic, they're getting their budget cuts. Unless they get some federal help, they can't fix those HVAC systems. And if you can't fix those HVAC systems, you cannot open the school safely. And so we need to have another round of supports. We need to open the schools because you're not going to open the economy without opening schools, and the children are missing out on education. They do much better academically if they're there in person. They get this nutrition from the school lunch. They get the socializing skills, dealing with people every day rather than sitting at home. You can identify child abuse better if it's there. There are a lot of reasons why we need to reopen the schools if it can be done safely, but you just can't open the schools without a plan and without the resources.
Not to mention, my wife and I are going crazy being executive assistants for our elementary age kids. So Congressman Scott, we've got a bunch of questions that I feel like we're
let me ask you the first question.
All right, let's do it.
Okay, what is your plan to help areas in southwestern Virginia that have been devastated by the closure of manufacturing plants and loss of industry?
So this question kind of deals with kind of the history and the legacy of this district, right? If you're in the southwestern portion of the district, we're talking about areas like Danville, that had Dan River Mills. Textile industry was really big here in the 5th district. You can even go up the road to where my wife is from in Appomattox County, and there is the Thomasville factory, which was furniture. But I think again, these are employers that were really critical to parts of Southside and parts of this district. And folks ask, well, so what happened? Those jobs left. Are they coming back? Well, there are a lot of factors there. So yes, we can talk about trade deals. We can talk about the USMCA and how that is going to hopefully bring some manufacturing jobs back to the United States. That alone, though, isn't going to replace the job loss from some of these large employers. And so first of all, you need the infrastructure. This is my perspective. First of all, you need the infrastructure. That critical infrastructure is things like rural broadband. So broadband internet is things like the educational infrastructure. And so on the broadband front, it's really hard to attract employers, and you don't want to spend all your time saying, hey, we're going to try to get the biggest employer to come to our community, because if you miss on that shot, you didn't bring anything back to your community. But you need to build that infrastructure. So on the broadband front, we've got the resources through the USDA, through the FCC. I know everybody in the Virginia delegation is committed to the idea of expanding rural broadband access, but it requires a public-private partnership to make sure we get that job done. And we'll talk more about that, I'm sure. But I think that's a critical ingredient to kind of filling some of that job loss. But some of that job loss is going to be filled by entrepreneurship. Again, broadband is helpful on that front. There's going to be automation in the manufacturing sector, and we have to understand and expect that. But some of the jobs are going to be in skilled labor jobs. Some of the jobs are going to be jobs that you talked about short-term Pell. And that's so important because we've got 6 community colleges with a presence here in the 5th Congressional District. And they talk about, hey, we have opportunities for vocational tech jobs. We have job training opportunities. Those are jobs that can help fill some of these roles, but also these good paying jobs that folks can carry with them for years ahead. And so I think all of these are parts. These are all the ingredients. You talk about our schools. We've got some schools that are struggling, and that's a key ingredient. We've had several reports here in Virginia and Southside in particular talk about how our schools have to be supported adequately. That's resources, per student, like per capita, but also resources for the schools themselves. We have crumbling school stock. So investing in education, investing in infrastructure like broadband, that's going to be a key ingredient. And the last thing I'd say is kind of the clean economy conversation. We've got some hubs for clean energy here in the 5th district. We know we've got to bring those clean energy jobs. That's the jobs of the future. We don't, yes, we can lament the jobs of the past, but we've got to prepare ourselves for the jobs of the future. And I think that's really, those ingredients are the pieces that I see as the most promising. Yes, let's continue to support agribusiness here in the 5th. That's going to be important. We got 18,000 farmers in the district. We want to make sure they're doing well. But I think that all of these things kind of come together. And I know you're in the Tidewater region. Anything else that you're seeing in terms of, because there's definitely some manufacturing in that area as well. how are we getting these jobs back?
Well, we have huge manufacturing. It's a lot of shipbuilding.
Yeah.
And so making sure that we continue building ships and our area is over reliant on the Department of Defense.
Mhm.
The economists tell us that about 40% or more of the economy in Hampton Roads is dependent on the Department of Defense. I didn't say federal spending,
Just
Department of Defense. We have an energy lab, we have NASA, FBI, Social Security, Medicaid, just Department of Defense, about 40% of the entire economy. So there's a lot that we have that we're getting. But one of the things you mentioned, infrastructure, the fifth district can't pay for all that infrastructure itself. We need an infrastructure bill. The House has already passed the Moving Forward Act, and it included a massive, the traditional roads and bridges, also broadband that you mentioned, and school construction. Those schools that need to repair their ventilation would be able to repair it with the money that's available under the Moving Forward Act. So the House has already passed legislation. We look forward to you coming up there and passing it again next year, and we have a Senate that'll actually pick it up.
And I know Vice President Biden stated infrastructure as being one of his priorities as well, large investment in infrastructure there. So yes, that's our roads, that's our bridges, that's our tunnels, that's our dams, our waterways. But yes, it's also just that infrastructure in terms of rural broadband. So I know the House has done quite a bit on that front.
Okay, next question is, what industries will you work to bring in the district? You talked a lot about that. One of the things we need to do is make sure we have an educated workforce so that anybody looking at the area would find it an attractive area where they can have a well-educated and potentially well-trained workforce. Are there any particular industries other than the ones you mentioned that you want to talk about?
Well, I do want to spend some time talking about clean energy because, like I did mention it already, but I think it's such an important space because we can feed two birds with one hand, because who needs to shoot birds? We can feed two birds with one hand. I think that the goal here is to say that yes, if we are investing in education and that's creating opportunities for folks to get plugged into these clean energy jobs. I think the estimate is somewhere around 29,000 clean energy jobs that could come to this district. That's huge for us. But I think we have to make sure we have a workforce that's prepared for it. It's also huge for our environment. And this is a district that cares deeply about the environment. It has two pipelines that are going to be coming through this district. The ACP, of course, was canceled for now. Mountain Valley Pipeline is still going to be coming through. But no, in terms of clean and renewable energy, we've got hubs in the Charlottesville area, BWXT down in the Lynchburg area. We have solar fields all down across Southside, a lot of investment there as well. And so I think that it is a good opportunity to invest. And then I think that even beyond that, in terms of other industry, sometimes we just need to remember that, that entrepreneurship, that's such a huge part of the lifeblood of any rural community. If you think about the jobs you invest in rural spaces, yes, you can talk about bringing in single employers, large employers, and that can help, but they can also leave. And we've had that experience here in the 5th District a lot. And so investing in and making sure that you've got small business grants for rural communities, if you look dollar for dollar, rural grants you get less small business grants for rural communities than in urban spaces, dollar for dollar, right? And yet still it's cheaper cost of living. You have more opportunities for folks to add to their communities, do well economically, and help really prop up. We have some population loss that you can address. So I think those things are all so important. But I don't want to speed past the education component there too fast, because that's so important to make sure that we're able to do this work. And I'm a product of public schools. So for me, I go back to that, Horace Mann notion of public schools, that it's that great equalizer and that everybody has opportunities to succeed. And for me, I went to a public school that was adequately invested in. So I remember the Virginia General Assembly helped make sure there was funding for a Commonwealth Governor's School in my area in 1998. And that's how I was able to do all these advanced credit courses that put me on a path for success. That was in the public school system. And yet it wasn't taking away from the resources within our public school. In fact, it was adding resources. That's helping everybody. So we've got to protect our public schools, got to make sure that they're doing well. Our teachers are clamoring for it. My mom's been a public school teacher for 31 years. That's an investment we have to make. It pays dividends in our communities.
Thank you. We've kind of touched on this a little bit, but the next question is, my son has to go to the local McDonald's to get access to a strong enough Wi-Fi for virtual school.
Mhm.
What will you do to help get broadband to families like mine all across the district?
Yeah, that's a story, unfortunately, an experience that we've heard too many times these past, 6, 7 months. And particularly if you live in Buckingham County or Madison County, and there's a reason for that. I point to those counties in particular. There's a reason for that. And so I'll start off by saying that we're in the Albemarle County school system, my wife and I, and so got a fourth grader and a kindergartner. When my fourth grader was getting ready to start virtual school this fall, had a conference call with her teacher. The teacher's asking us all these questions about my daughter, and then she ends with, and just making sure you have good broadband internet. And we were like, yeah, we do. But it struck me right then, what do you do if I say, no, we don't? What are our options? And down in Appomattox County, where Leanne is from, they've been relying on churches and small businesses and saying, hey, if you've got some Wi-Fi that you can extend to some of the youth here, that'd be great. They have kind of a call for businesses to offer that to the individuals there. That's a failure in our ability to invest in that infrastructure. We had a national broadband plan 10 years ago. 10 years ago, FCC had a national broadband plan. And so 10 years later, we are not where we wanted to be in terms of making sure that universally folks have access to broadband. You know this, Congressman Scott. I pride myself on being a bit of a nerd. And so when I pay attention to these issues, I dive deep. And I was just like, so what is the definition of broadband? What's our goal? And it's 25 megabits per second in terms of downloads, 3 megabits per second in terms of uploads. So that's kind of your standard. And if you look across the 5th Congressional District, 21 counties and 2 cities, it's very disparate. If you're in Charlottesville and Danville, urban spaces, over 99% broadband access. If you're in the northern part, the exurbs of DC, you Fauquier County, Rappahannock County, you still have north of 90% in terms of folks who have access to broadband. If you're in Brunswick County, down in the kind of southeastern side of the district, 30%. Cumberland County is around 30%. So there are at least 7 counties in our district that are somewhere between that 30 to 50% range in terms of folks having broadband access. That is absolutely unacceptable. How can we expect folks to participate in a modern economy without that basic infrastructure of broadband? And so I think that's a huge issue. It's huge for our kids. And I think right now the digital divide and the experience that that's causing in terms of driving greater economic disparities and educational disparities, we can't ignore that. We're going to have to make up for what's happening to our youth over the course of this year 2020, because the estimates from educational experts we've seen is that kids are falling a year behind in school right now before our very eyes because of our failures on broadband and our failures in terms of getting folks in school. And so I think there's a lot that we need to do. In terms of that kid in Buckingham County who's going to McDonald's to get Wi-Fi access, what do we do on the short term? Well, so, this is where another member of the Virginia delegation, Congresswoman Spanberg, has been awesome at trying to get those dollars back to the 7th Congressional District. She uses that USDA Reconnect program funding. And I know she actually worked with Congressman Riggleman, the current member here in the 5th Congressional District, to get $55 million to in funding to this area. I think it's so important that we're always trying to figure out how to get those dollars back. It's going to require a public and private partnership. Right now we're seeing a lot of, private sector philanthropic folks stepping up to create some Wi-Fi hotspots. That's a workaround. The truth is, it's never going to be in a business's interest to lay that last mile of broadband in rural spaces. That's why it's so easy in urban spaces, because it's more compact. But in rural spaces, you're going to have to overcome the financial disincentive to lay that additional wiring. And so that's where it's so important for federal investment. FCC also has funding, leveraging the Virginia Telecommunications Initiative funding as well. And then I always say, looking to examples from other states that are doing it really well. And I was actually on a call with Congresswoman Angie Craig from Minnesota, and we were just talking about what Minnesota is doing really well in the rural space, leveraging state dollars, leveraging federal dollars, leveraging private sector. That's how you have to do it to accomplish this goal. We, in short order, we have to get to that 100% fully, broadband. And I know Whip Clyburn had a bill that he introduced. There's $80 billion for broadband infrastructure, and that was the estimated amount it would take to fill that gap and accomplish those goals. We just need to make the investment, because it pays dividends if we make the investment. That's what we need. And again, it pays dividends over time.
Because you can't attract a business. The business says, how's your broadband? As soon as you give them the 30% number,
Right.
they said it was nice knowing you.
Right.
And they're gone.
Right.
It's That's something we're working on, and there's pretty good support.
Yeah.
We just have to make the investment, and
Well, that's not a
it's
Republican.
in the infrastructure bill.
Right. But I was going to say that's an area where Republicans also want us to have broadband access, right? That's one where, and even in the Virginia delegation, I remember hearing Ben Klein supports it, Morgan Griffin supports it, right? Like those are all things Congressman Riggleman supports it, right? And so those are all things that no matter who you are, if you're in Virginia and you've got some rural counties in your district, you know how critical this is. So in terms of what's standing in the way of that investment, it's kind of tough because I think right now, even politically, we recognize this serves all of us, no matter your ideology. It's just how this all gets bogged down in the larger political structures, and we just need to press through it.
Good. Let me see. Next question is: do you support raising the minimum wage? If so, to how much?
I laugh because it's funny you asking me about raising the minimum wage. I know this is a submitted question, but this is an area where you have deep expertise. So let me see if I can pass the test here. It's critical that we raise the minimum wage. I think that for too many people across this country, if you can work full time, and this is where I was when we sat down and talked the first time. I said, my feelings on the minimum wage were rooted in understanding where a lot of small business owners say they are, where they're just like, well, I'm worried about what happens if we increase salaries, and where a lot of people are, where they're just like, this salary isn't enough. And I say, if you're working at that minimum wage for 40 hours a week for 52 weeks a year, those are poverty level wages right now. And it takes until you get to almost $12 an hour before you get out of that poverty level wages. The truth is that shouldn't be the case if you're working that hard. Now you hear that argument that, very few, family, the folks who are the breadwinners for families are making that minimum wage, right? That's a starter wage. That is a wage that's acceptable to pay employees. You can always find somebody who will pay it. So we do need to raise that concept. I think that we have to have a process for it. And I do like how, your Raise the Wage Act, it's thoughtful. It does that over time. And I think that it's important that we raise it to at least $15. I think that's a benchmark that we have to hit. That's not even a living wage in all places in the United States, but it's a really good starting point for where we should be. $7.25, that shouldn't be the case for anybody. We have to get much farther than that. And I think we have to do that in a stepwise fashion. And so, when this was scored by the CBO, if I'm remembering correctly, they were saying that, certainly there was a job loss impact as you move up, and whose jobs are we losing and what kinds of jobs are we losing, and overall, what's the impact? And what I found, and where I found some piece on it, was that when you increase the wage to $15 an hour, you are lifting families out of poverty, and you're also giving folks more resources to engage economically, and that does create huge opportunities. The folks who are potentially losing jobs, again, there is a concern because disproportionately, from what I've seen, it's Black and brown women. So we have to find a way to make sure we mitigate that job loss. We do that through educational training. We do that through job training, all those opportunities for skills building, right, to make sure that folks have access to good paying jobs. But we have to have a standard for what a good paying job is here in the country. And I think that $15 is it. Then you're left with the question of, does it just, stay mired at $15 an hour forevermore? Does it languish there? And this is where I have to give you your kudos, because everybody usually talks about indexing it to inflation. But my interest here is how do we address some of the income inequalities? How do we address those gaps? And I think you indexed it in the bill, which I thought was really thoughtful, to average wages, so the area median income, which is important because I think it allows us to close gaps in terms of earning wages. And if we do that over time, we're actually moving our society forward. We're a generation that's going to earn less than our parents, which is really troubling. And I think it's the wrong direction, right? We want to have that economic mobility. So yeah, I'm in favor of raising the minimum wage. I'm in favor of really working with small business owners, making sure that they recognize, hey, folks having more money in their pockets, that's more money in our economy. That's more of an ability to engage economically. And so, yes, that's a big part of the design, is that we want people to have resources so they can participate and engage. But I understand it's going to be an ongoing conversation. This is one of those areas that's very deeply entrenched from a partisan standpoint. And even some of my good friends who are conservatives who are supporting my campaign, they say, but that minimum wage, it's bad for businesses. They say there's already a bargain between employers and employees. And what I always say is, it's such an unbalanced bargain. As the employee, you don't have the leverage to tell your employer, oh no, you need to pay me X amount more. They'll just find somebody else. So I think it's important for us to set federal standards. But I've got to hear from you. What are your thoughts? How do
The,
you arrive at that?
you talked about the bargain there. The chairman of the Committee of Jurisdiction in the Senate is on public record saying that he does not believe in a minimum wage,
Mhm.
any minimum wage, not increasing the minimum wage, any
Any.
minimum wage. If you don't want to work for $3 an hour, don't work for $3 an hour.
Right.
If you want to work for $3 an hour, work for $3 an hour. It just violates reality. I mean, the realistic situation. It's interesting on the job loss. You cited the CBO study, or the CRS, the Congressional Research Service study that showed on average job loss. But they looked at about 7 different studies, and half the studies actually showed a job increase.
Hmm.
Because if you increase the minimum wage, people at that level are spending all the money, and you actually stimulate the economy, creating jobs. It's done gradually, so you don't have the shock impact where you actually lose the jobs. But when they talk about job loss, some of it is a person in the bottom is going in and out of employment, taking temporary jobs here and temporary jobs there. So in a
Gotcha.
12-month period, they may only work 10 months. And so between jobs, there may be a month between jobs before they get the next job. With an increase in the minimum wage, well, maybe it's 2 months longer that they have to wait to get the next job. And if you add all those hours up, you get to the almost negligible job loss that's reported. But for the individual, if you're working 10% less and making twice as much per hour,
Mhm.
you're still a lot better off.
Yeah.
And so even with the job loss, if you calculate what the minimum wage worker will have at the end of the year, even with the months in between jobs, the vast majority will be much better off. But one curious thing about the debate, there was virtually no debate over the amount of the increase.
Hmm.
The debate was whether you should have an increase or not.
Mhm.
It wasn't said, well, 725, well, maybe not 15, how about 11, how about 10, 10, 10, how about 14? There was no discussion,
Okay.
even in committee. There was no amendment to bring it down. It was just a question of either yes or no,
Right.
which I found curious, because there wasn't any debate on if you're going to raise it. 15 didn't seem to be an issue.
Well, and I remember President Obama suggested 925, if I'm remembering correctly, or somewhere around there during his administration. And so, one thing that I did want to talk a little bit more about on that minimum wage conversation is that no policy exists in a vacuum, and we're in the midst of this pandemic and the coronavirus recession that it's caused. And so this is a genuine question, because I haven't seen the econometrics behind it, but with our current environment for small businesses, and we've seen a lot of small business loss in the country. Does this change the calculation on how you roll something like a minimum wage increase out in the midst of a recession like this?
That question was addressed by the General Assembly that passed essentially the same bill that I'd introduced and got passed in the House.
Yeah.
And the governor, it passed, and then the pandemic started kicking in.
Mhm.
The governor delayed it 6 months, and the General Assembly accepted the amendment.
Mhm.
So the $15 an hour is still alive and well. It's just delayed until such time as the virus is a little bit more behind us. But it's the small business aspect. The rent goes up. You don't hear people talking about uh, the problem. If it's a restaurant, cost of food goes up. No problem. Cost of furniture goes up. Cost of everything goes up. No problem. But
Right.
once you start talking about the cost of labor, all of a sudden, everything's going to fall apart.
Right.
Yes, you might have to increase your prices,
Mhm.
but the CBO report says the increase in prices will be in line with inflation.
Right.
You're going to be about raising your prices anyway. And so if you raise your prices with inflation, you should be able to absorb the increase in the minimum wage.
Gotcha. Yeah, no, it makes a lot of sense for me. It's always just what does the data show, and that's why I always enjoy getting into a minimum wage conversation with you because you always break out the data, and you always point me to the places where I can find some really good information. But no,
Well,
it's one that I think is
that's
really
what
good
I
for
like
me.
about you. You can look at the evidence and just not look at the speaking points.
Yeah.
Let's get to the next question. Is how will we rebuild the economy after COVID-19?
Yeah, it's hard to even say after COVID-19, right? This is going to be with us for a while. We have to build while we work through this pandemic. And so, the first thought is, well, what's happening in our economy right now? We know we had 22 million jobs lost, and certainly far more than that unemployment claims. But in terms of jobs we gained back, around 12 million. About 25% of those are temporary jobs, right? Census jobs, that sort of thing. So we're not in a great spot right now economically. We're in a really tough spot. And I think that, and you hear a lot of that alphabet soup, what's the shape of our recovery? And I've just seen an overwhelming amount of evidence that it is that notion of a K-shaped recovery. Some people are doing really well if they're in a certain economic space. If they're not in that certain economic space, they're not doing very well. It's hard to argue something other than that because that's the lived reality of so many people, especially with so much ongoing job loss. So I think that the first thing is we got to get our arms around this virus. I'm in a hospital where we were losing $85 million a month at the height of the pandemic. The impact that had on jobs. We had to furlough individuals, folks lost their jobs, all the physicians, we all took pay cuts, to make it through that pandemic. That was really difficult. If we have another spike, another wave of this pandemic with the requirement that we pull back and people aren't participating in our economy again, that's devastating, not just to hospitals like my large academic medical center, but to small businesses, to restaurants. I mean, if you look at the industries that are the hardest hit, they're not in a position to absorb another blow like that. So we have to get our arms around the virus first. Folks have to do what they have to do to make sure we keep those numbers low. In terms of the recovery from there, it starts by keeping money in people's pockets. So we got to keep people able to pay. So you mentioned the eviction crisis. People have to have a home to live in. If you want them to be able to participate in our economy, they have to have a home to live in. They have to be able to feed their families, right? It's the Maslow's hierarchy of needs. You have to meet those basic needs first. And that's what these stimulus payments are meant to do. They're meant to provide folks with those basic needs so that they can provide for their families, weather the storm, so to speak, and stay engaged in our economy. I think that there are other pieces in there like the unemployment insurance, making sure that people are still having those resources. And we can do that thoughtfully, right? It doesn't have to be a one size fits all, but it does have to be something that makes everybody whole for the time being, including our businesses. Disproportionately, our business loss, right? If you look at the small businesses that are hurt the most, it's those that don't have the pre-existing relationships with banks. And that's rooted in structural inequality. So it's going to be women-owned businesses, minority-owned businesses. So we have to design around that. We have to say, how do we design, grants, low interest financing that's available for those same businesses. And so those are the pieces that we put in place in the middle of this. On the other side of this pandemic, whenever that may be, whether it's late 2021, early 2022, whenever it may be, whenever we have sufficient uptake of a vaccine, I really think the focus is making sure that we're getting to that bread and butter. How do you build an economy? You build an economy through education. You build an economy through skills training. You build an economy through supporting small business. You build an economy through all those fundamentals. Again, infrastructure, all those fundamentals, that's what you have to invest in and really double down on, because what people are walking back into on the other side of this pandemic has to be fertile ground for economic growth. And if you looked at the American Reinvestment and Recovery Act and the impact that it had, it's kind of funny to me how people assume that there was this magic transition in 2017 in our economy. We were on a trajectory. We had job growth year over year in the Obama administration. We were at 2.3% increases in our economy those last few years. And so now in the Trump economy at 2.5%, it's a continued ongoing upward trajectory. We need to make sure that the growth in our economy is experienced by everybody. There are things that could be bad for certainly when you talk about businesses, we have to talk about taxes. And so there's some things we need to do around taxes. I think that Republican tax bill from 2017 doesn't serve everybody well, right? It doesn't serve the middle class, doesn't serve working class families. particularly well. And so I think we have to make sure that we revisit that to get those dollars back from a deficit standpoint. But we use them to build, like I said, put that infrastructure in place for economic growth more broadly. So there's a lot of rearranging we've got to do, but it's a critical rearranging.
You mentioned some very, very powerful, what Obama had done, and what I'm gonna do some low tech screen share
Okay.
by showing
I
this
see.
graph. This is a graph of the unemployment rate. And you see right here, Obama's economic plan went into effect. And the unemployment rate went down, 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 down until the pandemic exploded the unemployment rate.
Right.
Where do you see the Trump tax cut?
Yeah, it's going to be.
Not a wrinkle.
Yeah, it doesn't change the trajectory.
Nothing.
Yeah.
That you see Obama's plan, which costs about half as much as the Trump tax cut, you can see that it immediately started a downward slope on unemployment rate.
Right.
And when Trump came in, I mean, he was prancing around like a peacock, like he had done something.
Yeah.
All he did was sat in a hammock and watched the Obama economy continue to do well.
Right.
It went down from about 7 or 8% down to about 4%, and then down to about 3.5%. And Trump is bragging about all what he did. You can't see a wrinkle in this graph.
Yeah.
Not a wrinkle. He spent twice as much, did nothing.
Right.
And that shows you the effect of his tax cut. And then when it went off the roof, he said it wasn't my fault. He's so busy with his arm patting himself on the back that he wasn't able to fight the virus. But you're absolutely right. You're not coming out of this economy without first crushing the virus. And you have to have a strategy to do that. And just congratulating yourself on what a good job you're doing with no strategy won't do it. So and then you do the kinds of things that created the good economy to begin with. And as Powell said, at this point, there's more risk in not doing enough than doing too much. And we've got to do as much as we can to make sure things don't go south. Let's see if we can get another question in. What will you do to support labor unions that have been under attack at the state and federal level?
Yeah, I always start this conversation by saying there are very few candidates that people run into who actually worked for a labor union. So I used to work for SEIU, and I always tell people my support of labor unions is really born from understanding the power of collective bargaining and what it was that they were fighting for. They were fighting for their jobs to serve them and to serve their families in a really effective way. And then beyond that, they were saying, hey, those same benefits, they had great health care through their employers. They said those same benefits we enjoy, we want to fight for those for the American people. And so I worked on something called the Change That Works campaign for SEIU. That's the Service Employees International Union. And we were organizing around health reform in 2009. And so when I talk to folks about labor unions, it's not political to me. I don't think about kind of the way people line up in a partisan way. I think about, Antonio and Marcel. I think about Joe and Kim and Tim and the people who I was working beside every day and saying, wow, there's something to this idea of collective bargaining. There's a lot that we need to do for labor unions. I'll go ahead and say it. I'm in support of the PRO Act, and there's a reason. I think the PRO Act is really important. The ability and the right to organize is so critical. I think people are losing sight that fight for organized labor, what it did is it created the strength in the workers to go toe-to-toe with the employers and to be able to have that real conversation, that real bargain. As an individual worker, you can be replaced at any time. But as a collective, you have the strength to advocate for the things you actually need. And I think right now what's under threat is, I have to give some credit for some creative branding. By calling it right to work, you're making people think that it's about folks having the right to work. It's not. What it's actually about is siphoning support from labor unions to keep them from having that collective bargaining power. What it does is it means that you have people benefiting from the bargain without supporting the bargain in any way, shape, or form. So it's so important that all employees who benefit from the bargain are supporting that endeavor, supporting the administrative aspects of it. All those components that advocate for the wage increases, the the sick leave, the healthcare benefits, whatever it may be. Those things that were part of the bargain. That's really important. I think we have a pension problem with our labor unions, and we have a multi-employer pension problem in general. I think there's a lot of work we need to do around that because, again, there's a whole dynamic. Our federal employees have a similar conversation. Anywhere when pensions are under threat, that's a significant threat to our economy as a whole. If we end up with an entire generation of folks who just don't have the resources necessary and are depending on federal supports, well, that's not good. So when we can bolster these pension plans so that then they can leverage whatever resources they're able to gain from the market, it's a good thing. So I think there's some investment we need to do on that end as well. But I think that it's a conversation that's not as typical in Virginia. I lived in Chicago for 3 years when I was in law school, learned a lot about labor unions while I was there, but just recognizing there's a history to this. And I think of A. Philip Randolph, right? I think about the fact that there's a huge Black labor conversation as well, and how it's been a huge part of getting some level of equity for workers. No matter who you are, if you're a part of the bargain, you're a part of the bargain. That was really important as well. So I think we have to support labor. I think it's important. And I think also, I talked about this earlier, but when we're talking about good paying jobs and the skills gap that's coming, right? Our skilled laborers are retiring. So those skilled jobs that work for people, the reason they're good paying jobs is because somebody advocated to make those good paying jobs. And so we have to keep it that way. That's kind of the nature of my support. But I know this is another area of your expertise, sir.
Well, I appreciate your answer, and we're running close on time, so we got 2 more questions.
Okay.
I run a small business in Pennsylvania County that needs skilled plumbers and carpenters, but I constantly have to go out of state to find qualified workers. What will you do to give people skills that they can actually get them the good paying jobs?
So I've been down to meet with the plumbers and pipe fitters, the carpenters. I've been in these different spaces. I tried my hand at welding even along this campaign trail, and I realized how hard these skills actually are. Just in that time that I was there, we've taken several trips. It's so important that we have the apprenticeship programs, the job training programs that are necessary. What I saw was just how powerful it is when you take high school graduates or kids, some of them didn't even necessarily finish high school. You give them opportunities through these apprenticeship programs, through job training programs, and you can create literally a lifetime of a good paying job. So I think we need to support those programs. You realize there's a big difference between folks who've had the job training, who've had the apprenticeship program, and folks who haven't. The trade school, folks who haven't done those and folks who have. So for your small business in Pennsylvania County, you benefit if we invest in job training and vocational tech programs and skills building. We've got KTEC here in the Charlottesville area, so career and technical education. And that's something I worked on in the Obama White House. As part of the My Brother's Keeper initiative, that was one of the thrusts. And we worked with the Department of Labor at the time. We talked about how we can really introduce a lot of youth to these jobs, to these opportunities, and say, hey, this is a path to a good paying job, to opportunities for success in your future. And we need to make sure there are enough of those around. This isn't to suggest that this is the only path, right? I keep in mind, my own personal path took me through college, to medical school, to law school. That's not the path for everybody in our district. That allowed me to be a doctor, that allowed me to be a professor, but that's not the only path to a good paying job in this district. About 31% of the adults over age 25 in the 5th congressional district go on to a 4-year college, right? And so we got these 6 community colleges. That's one of the mechanisms that folks need to leverage to get opportunities to the jobs and to the good paying jobs they need. We have all the idea of skills training, vocational tech. We have to invest in that too, because that's what covers that other 68.5% of adults, make sure they have opportunities to succeed as well.
And like I said, the committee reported an apprenticeship bill that creates 1 million new opportunities and expands the kinds of jobs for which apprenticeships will be available, not just the normal building trades, but also healthcare and others. And they're stackable credentials and recognized nationally, so that if you move to Seattle, Washington, they know what you can do, and you can go get some more credentials and build up on them. Nursing is is obviously the one where you start off as a regular nurse, licensed nurse, registered nurse, and and you can build on your credentials and move up. And as we have to use the community colleges. We have to make sure the jobs are there. That's why the infrastructure bill. People want to be a welder or pipe fitter or something like that. You have to make sure the infrastructure bill passes so the jobs to be done. So when they complete their apprenticeship, there's work to do. So we got a lot of work there. And a final question: what are your plans to help small businesses like restaurants survive through the pandemic, where we either have to shut down or folks are too scared to come in and eat?
Well, I think that the first thing is the idea of folks being scared to come in and eat. That's because we've got a virus that's making people sick and could do more harm, right? So it's important that we have the resources necessary for our small businesses, particularly our restaurants, because that's one of the sectors that's been the hardest hit to stay afloat through this pandemic. You're employing individuals in your community. So either we're supporting you to keep them employed through things like the payroll protection program, right? Supporting those kind of resources, or we're going to be supporting that individual in some other way. It's much better for us economically to support your business to remain an engine of creating jobs and creating opportunities and being a benefit to your community. So that's the reason why we invest in this payroll protection. That's the reason why we invest in keeping these small businesses all over our district, all over our Commonwealth, and all over the country open. I think that we lose track of that sometimes when we start worrying about just austerity and we start saying, hey, we're spending money. We are spending money today so that we are not spending far more money tomorrow. We've got to keep these businesses alive and well in our communities, and especially in rural spaces. Think about the number of businesses that have been hard hit, that have lost foot traffic. I was down in Farmville in Prince Edward County, and they're dependent on the fact that those students came back to school, because without that foot traffic, so many more businesses would have closed. We hear the same thing here in the Charlottesville area. And so we're stuck in this place where we say we need the students here to participate in this local economy to keep these businesses afloat, but we need them to be incredibly safe, because if the virus gets out of hand, we're going to be back where we were in April. That's the moment that we're in. So we need to actually spend money to do both things, to keep communities safe, to do testing, to have personal protective equipment, to make sure our essential workers know that they should stay home if they're having symptoms, to have child care, to make sure that our education spaces are open if you're going to open spaces, right? This stuff is also interrelated. But for small businesses, we've got to invest in keeping you open. And you know, I've heard the statement, there's no amount of investment that's a substitute for the American economy. The American economy is under attack by a virus that 7.5 million Americans have gotten, 210,000 Americans have died from. And so the truth is, it is wreaking havoc on our country. We've got to get it under control. And while we're doing that, because just to be frank, our leadership right now is not capable of doing that well. You know, the New England Journal of Medicine, I don't know if you saw this, Congressman Scott, the New England Journal of Medicine just yesterday had an editorial. The entire editorial board came out and said, we need new leadership in this country to address this pandemic. That is, it's happened only in a handful of times before, but this is like one of the leading medical journals just saying we don't have the people in place to tackle this pandemic. And that's what we need to recognize. We've got to invest in tackling this pandemic in a smart, science-driven way, and at the same time, keep our businesses afloat while we get the leadership in place, the thoughtfulness in place to tackle this pandemic the right way.
Well, you're absolutely right. There's no strategy right now, and if we don't kill the virus, if we don't crush the virus, we're not going to be able to protect businesses. Restaurants and airlines specifically are in the updated HEROES Act for specific support, because they're both going under if we don't come up with some with some help. We found that in the first CARES bill, the PPP, the Payroll Protection Program, did not get down to the small businesses. The big guys scooped up all the money. And so when we had an additional funding, we set it up in such a way that this actual small businesses would have the first shot at the money. And that worked out a lot better than the first round. But this has been an incredible conversation, Cameron, and I can't wait for somebody of your intellect and willingness to look at evidence and strategies, and have a plan to deal with the problems of the day. I can't wait to have somebody like you and serving in Congress, and look forward to that. And we'll do everything we can, and look forward to it November 3rd. And then don't wait till November 3rd. Get out there and vote early. In every county, in every city, in every county, there's an opportunity to vote early. We want to take advantage of that. So on election day, we ought to have enough votes in the bank. So Cameron's already got enough to win. Cameron, good luck, and we look forward to serving with you.
Thank you so much, sir. Really appreciate you coming out and sharing your expertise, but also sharing the conversation. It's an important one. And thank you all for tuning in, watching for a little bit. And we'll keep these going. We'll keep doing these conversations as long as it's beneficial. Just a couple more days to go, but let's win this thing on November 3rd. Y'all take care. Bye-bye.